Hey everybody, it is me again. I am coming to you from Cincinnati, Ohio, where I have been the keynote speaker for the Diocesan Convention, and I'm I am taping here in the beautiful Residence Inn. And if you ever come to Cincinnati, stay at the Residence Inn because they have a kitchen and you can make your own coffee in the morning, which is super. I want to go over the readings for this week that I assigned, as well as look back at last week's because I forgot to mention one of the assignments is the section of my DMin thesis on liturgical theology. And I basically gave that to you as a way to think about liturgical theology overall, but also to remember that the liturgy itself is a theological event. You can think of liturgical theology in one of two ways: primary liturgical theology being the act of liturgy. So we actually learn about God in the midst of our prayer. And secondary liturgical theology is that sort of theological reflection on the liturgy. So if there's some stuff in there that you're interested in knowing more about, let me know. I want to talk some about Malloy's chapters and let you guys know that one of the reasons I selected this text for you is because he does a really good piece of work around liturgical principles. So in several of the chapters, including chapter 3 and chapter 4, I think, he makes use of listing his liturgical principles and then writing about each one. And I'm not asking you to buy wholesale any or all of those principles. Some are really good, some I have arguments with, but it's a way to think about how to use the prayer book. So what are the principles by which you're going to be engaging with the prayer book? How are you going to make choices when it comes to the prayer book? It is the case that we have both the text of the prayer book and we also have the rubrics for the prayer book, the way that the text is to be thought of or done, or the rules or stuff like that. And he also makes an interesting point in one of the earlier chapters. I promise I'll get to this week's readings, about vague rubrics. That is, sort of rubrics that make you choose what you're going to do, which I think is actually a really helpful way of getting to what the idea of the prayer book is something that enlivens a real act of worship is all about. And you may have had the experience of being in a liturgy that was just kind of dead because it was either not thought through or the rubrical choices were not taken seriously or something like that. So again, it's all about the principles that are guiding our choices. I want to talk to you about chapter 4. I have little tiny post-it notes that I made notes on, so that's what I'm grabbing. Which is talking about space. This week's readings are about space stuff and time, as well as Fabian's paper, which I'll get to in a second. Chapter 4 is talking about the space for the church. And, he does a great historical piece of going through why so many Episcopal churches look like, Gothic churches, which is an interesting historical piece. And his repeating that kind of narrative around space is really super important. But the question that caught my attention in chapter 4 was the reflection on Cranmer, where Cranmer rearranged his space and the Gothic buildings to reflect his theological understanding of what the prayer book required. And the question that occurred to me in the reading was sort of, what is the holiest place in the building? How do we privilege different areas of the building? And why do we privilege different areas of the building? It's an important question to get into because space, the building of the church, is not just a functional thing, it's also a container. It's like a container of the community's memories, its aspirations, its hopes. It's where people come for the most important moments of their lives: birth, marriage, death. And so to consider the idea of what the space is for and how the space is used is critically important. Even though, I was thinking about where I've done Eucharist before in the past, including like on an upside-down surfboard on the beach once. So it's not so much that you can't have liturgy just anywhere, but if you have a space, how do you want to use that space? I think that the section that he writes about the placement of the altar is interesting and also um, helpful in that we're all going to have to do work in different churches, different arrangements, different ways the altar is set up. And I think that his point of saying that the way the altar is arranged, the space of the altar, and all of that, really is more about showing that what we're doing is praying as opposed to enacting. And he continues to go back to the idea that what we're doing in worship is prayer, not enactment of prayer, which I find to be a very compelling argument. He continues in and I did notice that he's like writing about my church in his book, which is always kind of like, oh, well, that's where I work. He continues in chapter 5 to talk about stuff. And I think it's interesting that he talks about stuff in a way that is fairly conservative, not in a political sense, but just in the sense of conserving tradition. And I can't remember which chapter he says it in. It's sort of like, if you don't know what to do, always default to the Roman Catholic rite. Well, Pat was a Roman Catholic priest for a while. And there's certainly an argument to be made that if you don't know what to do, default to the Roman Catholic rite. And at St. Gregory's, we actually tend to default more to the Eastern Christian tradition. So it raises the important point of what do you do when you don't know what to do? Or as I like to say, how do you consciously appropriate tradition so that you're doing what nourishes the community most practically, most wholesomely, and also in terms of being faithful witnesses of Christ. So how are we using the choices we make for missional and evangelical purposes? He gets to chapter 6, which is about time. He uses the technical term anamnesis, which you are probably familiar with. Somebody once said to me, anamnesis is remembering, but as opposed to remembering what it was like to eat peanuts at a baseball game when you were a teenager, it was like remembering the first kiss you had at a baseball game when you were a teenager. So it's something that is emotionally grounding and resonant and pulls you back into a moment of time. He does a beautiful piece on the seasons of the year and the sort of creation of the seasons of the year. And he puts a lot of energy into the Triduum, the 3-day-long event which celebrates the Paschal mystery. He makes the very important point that it is not 3 different liturgies, it's one liturgy, it's one day. It's one continual event, which is a great way to think about liturgical time. Not sort of like we're going to reenact this, we're going to reenact that, because that's crazy. I mean, what we're doing is not reenacting, what we're doing is praying. And in fact, my argument would be that the calendar of the church is really just a lectionary. It reflects the readings that we have, and perhaps the lectionary was plugged into the calendar instead, or the calendar was plugged into the lectionary instead. But the point is that the readings are the thing that give us a sense of time. And then he makes the very fabulous point that the liturgical year is now. It is not a sort of nostalgic trip back in time. I gave you Rick Fabian's paper, which is a little dense, and he's an eccentric writer, but he's also the founder of St. Gregory's Church. So a lot of what he has written strongly influences the way that I understand the liturgy and the prayer book and the use of the prayer book. It also serves as a little bit of a counterweight to Malloy's book, which, as I said, is a somewhat conservative text. So, with all of that, enjoy the readings this week. If you've got questions about the readings or you have things that stood out for you in the readings, do put those up on the Moodle site. If you've got questions you want to ask the group, do that as well. The best way that the Moodle site will work for us is if we can engage in some more robust kind of conversations with each other. And I recognize that the schedule of the readings is something that may or may not work for you. But what I'm hoping is that if something from last week came up, you can do it this week, and so on through the course. Anyway, I will look forward to seeing what you post on the Moodle site. I'll also look forward to seeing what kind of questions you come up with. Hope you have a great week, and we'll check in next time. Next slide.